Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT ranked meta video. Our analysts are here to go through the 11.3 meta for each stage of the game. We'll be recapping the meta in terms of items, compositions, and in general how to play during the early, mid, and late game. As you can probably already guess, there's going to be a large emphasis on rerolling as that style of play has taken over the meta. With all that said, let's dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. As usual, we'll be starting off our ranked recap by covering items, which will also include component priority for early carousels. While there's a fair amount of diversity in items, the fact is you'll be at a distinct disadvantage if you aren't able to secure specific items for certain champions. That means playing flexible and slamming early items takes a back seat to trying to force a composition or carry based on the components you're able to procure early on. That said, there are still a few options in regards to early items you can make that won't dictate the way that you'll play later on in the game. Sunfire Cape, for example, is one of the better options as it's a fantastic early game item and does well enough on frontliners later on. Hand of Justice is another example as it's usable by a wide assortment of champions, which means you're not hindered by having it early. There are more all-around useful items, but let's shift back into components by talking about carousel priority. The components you're generally going to see contested the most are sword, bow, and glove. After that, it's going to be middle priority items like tier, rod, and chain vest, with belt and cloak having low priority. Sword you'll use for items like Deathblade or Giant Slayer as they pair well with auto attack focused champions like Olaf and Talon. Hextech Gunblade has also risen in popularity, which is good for carries like Nidalee, Katarina, or Aurelion Sol. Infinity Edge gets a fair amount of attention due to assassins, but it's not an item you generally prioritize early on. Glove, as mentioned, is great for Hand of Justice. Besides that, you're going to see Jeweled Gauntlet made often, as it's great for high magic damage champions like Nidalee and Aurelion. Bow is possibly the most contested component because it's necessary to play Kayle, Zed, and quite a few other units like Olaf, Shyvana, and Akali. Generally, Bow is going to go towards RFC, but Rageblade, Titan's Resolve, and Runaan's Hurricane are all top tier items. As for the middle priority components, well, we've already touched on Sunfire Cape for Chain Vest, but it can also be used for Guardian Angel or Titan's Resolve. There's a lot of items to use a rod for, but the main reason it's not higher in priority is bow and sword tend to be heavily contested. But if you do get a rod, you can use it for Jeweled Gauntlet, Rageblade, or Hextech Gunblade. Tier is usually for Hand of Justice, but blue buff is a decent item choice when running AP carries like Veigar or Nidalee. Chojin also works in those cases, though it's lower priority than other sword items. And lastly, there's belt and cloak. Belt isn't bad since it's used for Sunfire Cape, but getting stuck with multiple belts can be tough. Cloak is also not terrible anymore since Dragon Claw is a potent mid to late game defensive item, but it's unlikely to be contested, so you can almost always grab one later on. All in all, there are a lot of item options in the meta, but those items do dictate whether you're able to play efficiently each game. With items covered, let's move into the different stages of the game, beginning with the early game. The early game starts right out of the gate with the beginning carousel and goes to the early rounds of Stage 3. Since we've already talked about the beginning carousel, let's move into Stage 1. Generally, this stage goes by quickly without much thought, but in the current reroll meta, there's a few important things to keep in mind. First is what Chosens, if any, you're presented with. For the most part, any Chosen is a viable pickup for the early game, but with rerolling being so prevalent, you may want to be slightly more picky than usual. Basically, there's certain champions you will for sure want to buy, such as Nidalee, Yasuo, and Nasus. It's also a good idea to be scouting early game to see what Chosen units other players hit. This can be crucial information as to whether pursuing certain compositions is a good idea or not, as heavily contested champions, and even one-cost ones, can cause issues later on. As we move into Stage 2, let's talk about leveling in the early game. The standard tends to be aggressively leveling to 4 on either 2-1 or 2-2, and you can also pre-level at the end of 1-4 if you have money for it. The point of leveling so early is for the potential to hit a 2-cost Chosen. But with one cost being so strong in the current meta, it's also viable to wait to level, though if you haven't hit by 2-2, it's probably a good idea to level. Most 2-cost Chosen champions are going to be strong if you hit them, so buy and play them if you have the money to do so. It's okay to not hit 10 gold early game, as the power spike you get from the Chosen champ should help you win streak. Make sure to level to 5 on 2-5 unless you're waiting to see if rerolling is an option. Once Krugs happen, you should have decided whether rerolling is an option or not. This is decided by having a good Chosen one-cost champion, around 5 or so of said champion, and it's not overly contested by other players. Otherwise, you're likely to play standard from this point on. Let's now move into the mid-game, which begins during Stage 3 and ends in the early rounds of Stage 5. During Stage 3 is where a lot of pivotal decisions will be made. First, if you've decided to reroll, you're going to begin slow rolling your gold once you hit 50. This should be around Stage 3 too, if not one round earlier. The goal is to 3-star your main carry, which will ideally be at the end of Stage 3 or early Stage 4. Loaded Dice also makes this and mid-game reroll compositions much stronger to play, as you may high roll the shop and get a much faster 3-star than usual. If you either weren't presented with a 1 cost chosen to roll for or decided to play more standard, you're going to want to level to 6 around 3-2 or 3-3. At this point, you'll need to decide if you're too weak and need to roll to stabilize. It's good to scout to see what other players are doing, as you'll be slower to hit later power spikes if you roll at level 6 and may take a lot of damage from reroll comps that hit during Stage 4. One more thing about Stage 3 is if you hit chosen champions like Zed, Katarina, or Akali. These champions are all playable in mid-game reroll builds, so finding them during Stage 3 can be a good way to hit a stronger power spike in Stage 5. Another thing to keep a lookout for are 6-piece traits such as Warlords, Cultist, and Dragon Soul, as they may provide a lot of power during Stage 3 and most of Stage 4. The next key stage to focus on is Stage 4. Stage 4 is where early reroll compositions will be hitting their power spikes while the rest of the lobby tries to survive until they get their builds online. As mentioned earlier, the goal for reroll builds is to hit their 3-star somewhere between the end of Stage 3 and early Stage 4. Once that power spike is reached, they'll be leveling, but most importantly, they'll be dealing a lot of damage to other players. The quicker you hit a reroll build, the higher the chances you have at placing in the top 4. The standard leveling time for most other players will be on 4-1 to hit level 7. Much like level 6, you will need to roll here if your board is weak. Roll to hit upgrades with some type of transition carry like Kindred, or if you get a bit lucky, roll into a 4-cost carry. Besides that, look to upgrade your front line, as that's a great way to reduce the amount of damage taken. Stage 4 is also where mid-game reroll builds will begin rolling for their 3-star units. Zed will be slightly faster, as you usually roll for him at level 6, while Katarina and Akali are better suited to roll for at the beginning of level 7. Overall, the gameplay is the same: hit 50 gold and slow roll. One last thing during Stage 4 is level 8. For anyone not rerolling and wanting to hit a chosen 4-cost, level 8 is your goal. Look to level sometime between 4-5 and 5-1. The soft rule to follow here is only level if you have around 30 gold left over, so that you can roll a reasonable amount if needed. Before we move on to Stage 5 in the late game, let's quickly cover some of the compositions from the meta. There's early reroll builds, mid-game reroll builds, and your standard 4-cost carry builds. Early game reroll builds can be practically any 1-cost champion, but the most common are Nidalee Warlord, Yasuo Duelist, Diana Spirit, and Nasus Divine. Each build is fairly self-explanatory, as you're aiming to 3-star the main carry, then fill in your board with relevant traits. Mid-game reroll builds aren't quite as open, since Zed is really the only 2-cost worth 3-starring, as a carry at least, and the 3-cost champions are harder to hit consistently. The common ones to play in the mid-games are Zed Spirit, Akali Ninja, Katarina Warlord, and Shyvana Brawler. Most of these require specific items to be played, but the builds are easy to follow, much like early reroll comps. Lastly, there's standard 4-cost carry builds. The strongest, and because of that the most contested, is Kayle with Executioner and Divine. But you do need a lot of bows for Kayle, and 2-starring her is essential, so make sure to scout before committing. Other compositions include Olaf Slayer, Aurelion Elderwood, and Talon Assassin. Basically, to play these builds, you're going to want the necessary items for the carries, and preferably roll a relevant chosen for them at level 8. Okay, after the brief look at the meta compositions, let's get back to covering the stages of the game by transitioning into Stage 5. Stage 5 is practically where every build should be converging towards level 8. Reroll builds should either have hit or be hitting their 3-star champions, and 4-cost carries will be rolled for and 2-starred. In some cases, you'll low roll, so the best thing you can do is spend your gold and pivot towards what the game gives you and aim to hit somewhere between a 6th and a 4th. The pace of the game will speed up at this point as well, so make sure you're scouting diligently to not get caught off guard and take a heavy loss. Preserving health is the easiest way to consistently place in the top 4. Level 8 and Stage 5 is also where 5-cost champions will be coming into play. Some players may high roll them at level 7, but most players won't begin seeing them until level 8. There's many different ways that you can utilize 5-cost champions, but some of the top choices are Samira, Swain, Zillion, and Ornn. Samira can be pivoted into as the main carry with Slayer, as she does a ton of AoE damage. Swain is a great frontliner, plus he makes splashing in Siphoner a lot easier. Zilean is just an all-around solid utility champion that fits into most compositions thanks to Mystic. Ornn is a special case as you want him as soon as you can to start farming the artifact items. There's no way to guarantee what artifact you get, but having one or two will often be a large boon to your board. And with that, we can briefly touch on the late game. The key to the late game, for the most part, is scouting and positioning. Being diligent at both will ensure you win rounds you may otherwise have lost, or at least minimize the damage you take. There's no real secret to it either, as it takes experience to do both efficiently. The other late game aspect is level 9, which for the majority of players won't be obtained. But if you're either in a strong position or have nothing left to upgrade your board for, you can look to level 9. In general, it's a bit too costly, so don't worry about it too much. Instead, focus on hitting your early and mid game. Improving those aspects will help you in hitting level 9 more consistently. Lastly, make sure you spend your gold before losing. While it's an obvious statement, it's common for players to greed and wait to spend gold. Instead of waiting until you're one round from dying, try spending a few rounds earlier, as that could be the difference between getting a fourth and a third. That's going to be it for today's video, folks. Overall, we're going to meta with a lot of diverse comps, but the gameplay flow is definitely stale with rerolling being so common. The next patch looks like it will shake up a lot of things. Let us know in the comment section below what you're looking forward to most in patch 11.4. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.